Where Man and Monster Meet. Chapter 3. The Price of Beauty. It looks like I'm dead, the princess thought to herself. I should be dead. Cassandra lay on the floor of the octagonal room, looking at her reflection in the mirrored walls. She hated her reflection, and no matter where she turned, she could not escape it. It echoed a voice from her past she could never be rid of. It was the incarnation of her curse. You are a foolish child. Beauty will not gain you love, but so that you may learn, I shall grant you the gift of its curse. Those were the haunting words the enchantress had spoken. For centuries, Cassandra had contemplated those words. Immortality, eternal youth, and eternal beauty had been bestowed upon her by the enchantress. Everyone who stared at her, the men with desire, the women with hatred, as though she were a goddess or perhaps a monster. Cassandra had often wondered if they even saw her at all. She had wanted to shrink, to become so small and insignificant no one would notice her, to slip away from the world and all existence. Wars had been threatened for her hand in marriage, and so the king had locked his daughter in a tower. He swore if any man could climb to the top, they could have his daughter's hand. No one had come. Her beauty would never permit her to be loved. She knew that now. Cassandra rose, standing inches away from the mirror, watching as she ran her fingers down her cheek. Everything about her appearance revolted her, and she often wondered if she really was beautiful. I should be dead, she thought to herself. I should be dead. The thought of returning home weighed on Alexander as he stood in the outer courtyard of the castle, waiting to be permitted into the king's chambers. Having no home to return to, this was the closest thing he would ever experience. The city of Omnes stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean. He had been here only once before, when he had been very young, but he knew most of the city's stories. Many nights of Alexander's childhood had been spent at the local tavern of his hometown, sitting alongside his father, listening to an older generation reminisce of their great adventures. His father had been a great storyteller, and he often spoke of this ancient city. He had once saved the life of its king, starting an unorthodox but intimate friendship. Alexander had vague memories of his father introducing him to the king. Now he waited to be introduced to him again. Why, after all this time, had the king summoned him? Alexander had several theories. None of them was pleasant. Upon entering the city, Alexander felt as though he had become the specter in some long-forgotten fairy tale. The winter snow carried a bewitching effect as each delicate flake fell, blanketing the city in visual purity. Children too naive to recognize the dangers of sickness ran about trying to catch snowflakes. Was it foolishness or mere innocence? As he stood in the palace courtyard, he studied the two guards who detained him. It was no mystery to them. Alexander was not royalty. His sandy blonde hair was shaggy, but not long enough to hide his face. A tattered and faded blue-gray cape hung off his right shoulder, covering the mark he bore on his arm. Scuffed leather armor protected his chest, but still permitted a good range of motion. His body stood tall and lean. Nonetheless, his appearance still witnessed to his strength. The soldiers could see he was a warrior, but not a soldier like them. Alexander observed their thick, steel-plated armor. He is ready, said one of the king's personal guards, poking his head out from a side door. Alexander followed the guard through a series of passages. The king's private chambers had been arranged to mimic his throne room, with a chair at the end of his bed and a warming fire in the hearth. The first thing Alexander noticed was the stench, and it confirmed his suspicion. Death wears perfume, and the king was soaked in it. He sat in an elaborate oak chair, with withered hands curled tight over its armrest. His gaunt face looked up, and he watched Alexander through sunken, swollen eyes. What little bits of fragmented hair he had left had gone white with age or anxiety. Alexander had been around violence so long he had almost forgotten what natural death looked like. The king's advisers stood at a distance, where the king could not see them, speaking in whispers and hushed tones. Alexander ignored the vultures as he stepped forward into the king's gaze. "Alexander," the king spoke softly, "you have grown." "My king, it is an honor," Alexander replied. "Am I still king?" he asked, looking away as if he could somehow see the horizon through the stone walls of his chambers. "These days I feel so awful, it's difficult to remember I'm still a man." "Allow me to remind you," Alexander said, bowing low. "You are so much like your father. He would be very proud of the man you have become." And Alexander felt a pang of grief in his heart. He had often wondered what his father would have thought of his journey to manhood. He answered, "Thank you, my king." "All sons make mistakes, and all fathers love them in spite of their flaws," the king offered, sensing Alexander's hesitation. He paused before switching subjects. "I know this journey must not have been an easy one. I can never tell you how much it means to me." "You summoned me," Alexander replied. The king sighed. "I must ask a great deal of you. There is an army coming. They will destroy our lands and raze the city. It is no secret I am dying, and my son is young and impressionable. He is in no way ready to defend the city from a force like this. He needs a guide. Your father and I once defended your homeland, and though it was never your home, I must now ask you to do the same." The king bowed his head in shame. Alexander watched as the advisors shared looks of disapproval and spite. "Who is coming?" Alexander asked. "The savage," the king replied, and Alexander knew of whom the king spoke. Cain. The prince awoke, his heart racing. Sleep had liberated him from the unbearable questions which plagued his mind, but now sleep abandoned him. He had been dreaming again, though he often referred to his dreams as nightmares. He had dreamt of her, and he knew his mind would be a slave to her for the better half of this day. He got up from his bed and made his way over through his room to the table. Though no one would ever guess, he possessed one of the largest rooms in the castle. Blankets of animal skins lay strewn about, not only to decorate his bed, but to prevent the cold, which seemed to be the very essence of the stone floor. Artwork stood propped up on makeshift frames above the room, creating the illusion that he lived in a sort of a maze. On the table sat a basin of water his servants had left for him. Next to the basin lay a wedge of cheese and a plate of assorted fruits which were on the verge of expiration. The servants had also left several candles scattered about the table and his room to provide a dim light. He stared at the basin for a moment, watching the shards of ice that had formulated overnight float about, before dipping his hands in and splashing the frigid liquid on his face. Not even the coldest water could wash his mind clean of the dream, or more specifically, of her. He had been 12 years old when he had first heard the legend that the city he was destined to rule possessed the most beautiful woman ever known to man. That's when the dreams had begun, and his dreams were the closest he would ever be to her. They had begun as the face of a woman, then conversations, but then as the years passed, something had changed. Now she would come to him in tears. Why? She would ask him. He could not bear to see her tears. He wanted to comfort her. He wanted to tell her. He would reach for her, only to find he was reaching through empty air. One moment he was there, and the next he was not. He was falling. The prince trembled at the thought. After drying his face, and clothing himself more appropriately for the temperature, the prince began to maneuver through the chaotic mess towards his desk. Clusters of paints and charcoal cluttered the edges of his workstation like ornaments on a shrine. Parchments with his sketches of varying degrees of completion adorned the center of the table with the face of his obsession. He gazed at his most recent sketch. The sound of a servant approaching made him look up from his work. "What is it?" he asked. "He has come, Prince Silas," the prince stated. "Where is he now?" Silas asked, still staring at his work. "In the training yard, I believe." Silas dismissed him. After several more minutes, the prince rose and left for the training yard. He passed through a large network of hallways and corridors until he arrived at a small wooden door that led to the soldiers' barracks. Silas opened the door and crossed the threshold into a long hallway with rooms on either side. Each room had 2 beds, 2 desks, and 2 sets of shelves, one set on each side of the room. His father had brought him to the barracks as a child. The hallway had seemed much longer then. Every bed had been made, every piece of armor polished and ready, as though they themselves were soldiers. It had been pristine. If not for the few personal items on the shelves and desks, it had been hard to imagine anyone actually lived there. He averted his eyes from the rooms he passed now. The unkempt manner in which the soldiers conducted themselves had led to the disheveled state of their living quarters. The city had fallen so far. As he reached the far side of the barracks, the prince heard the soldiers in a commotion. They seemed unsettled. The door at the far end of the barracks stood open. It led to a terrace which overlooked the soldiers' training ground. The training ground consisted of a row of targets for archery practice, 10 targets in length. There was a forge in the back where the soldiers could equip themselves with and repair their armor. And in the center was a hand-to-hand and weapons training circle the soldiers often called the pit. The men were silent as the prince stepped out into the terrace, but the silence was not for him. The prince had never seen so many of the city soldiers at the same time, not even at the annual city festival when the soldiers put on a special parade to show for the king. Hundreds of men stood waiting, watching, their eyes locked on one figure. He stood in the pit, Alexander. "I understand your concerns," Alexander continued to address to the men. "I am a foreigner here, but my father fought alongside your king many years ago. I come to you today by the king's request. We will train together, and together we shall prevail. If any of you should question my command, let him step into the ring with me now." The prince could not help but smile at Alexander's speech. He was not the greatest orator the prince had ever heard, but he had spoken with honesty and authority. This was his power play. The prince could not help but wonder if this man could deliver. One at a time, several men stepped into the ring, and one at a time, Alexander beat them. He moved through combat with a grace the prince had never seen. He was not a brute who depended on strength alone. Every motion he made was swift and deliberate. The prince watched, recalling his father's words. "Fighting is like a dance with death." This man must have courted death for years. It was the only way he could have learned the dance so well. With or without weapons, it was clear Alexander would be the victor. The men watched, jeering at each other, goading one another to be the next contestant. It did not take long before the challenges ceased. Alexander had won the respect of his men. The prince watched him waiting in the ring, confident, patient. Beads of sweat hung off his hair, several escaping down his face. His breath remained steady. He was tired, but by no means exhausted. A marking on his right shoulder caught the attention of the prince. It depicted a soldier's helmet on the hilt of a sword. The sword had been planted in the ground and a cape wrapped around it. Not many men knew its significance, but the prince did. There had been stories of a legion, an elite fighting force. After each battle, they would bury their enemies, leaving their equipment to mark their grave. The legion had been undefeatable. Many years ago, after a great battle, they had disappeared. They had vanished and were never heard from again. The prince descended the stairs onto the training grounds. As he stepped into the pit to face Alexander, a hush fell over the men as if he had cast a spell. They watched like statues, in silence and awe of the impending duel. After a moment of eyeing one another, the prince broke the silence. "So you are the one my father has chosen to lead our army," he said, examining Alexander. "Why are you here, training the army of a city doomed to fail?" Whispers of Cain's name could be heard passing through the troops. "Your father asked for my help," Alexander answered. "The people believe my father is a very wise king, but the elders disagree. They feel he has become desperate in his sickness." The prince motioned to a nearby soldier for 2 swords. "What do you believe?" the prince asked, handing one to Alexander. "I guess we're going to find out," he replied. The silence broke and the soldiers began to rage, yelling, cheering, and placing bets. The prince moved first, lunging at Alexander, and so the dance began. Every move the prince made, Alexander countered with ease. It was as if he could anticipate his opponent's every move. The prince had been wrong about this man. Alexander had not courted death. He was death. In spite of all of Silas's effort, he could not help but wonder if this man was going easy on him. Then, seeing an opening, the prince took it, and in one swift motion disarmed Alexander. The fight was over. "You are one of the most gifted fighters I have ever encountered," the prince said. "Thank you, my prince. My name is Silas, and you, Alexander, shall lead the city's army." He turned to leave. "Meet me in my chambers when you have finished with the men." "If I could only have one woman in my life, I would choose you." Cassandra could still hear the words. The first time she had heard them, they had been branded themselves onto her heart. Her father had said them, but not to her. Those words had been for the daughter of a visiting nobleman. Cassandra could still recall the young woman's face, eyes full of mirth and mystery, encased by long dark hair. Her scarlet lips had locked into place with the king's as he kissed her passionately. Cassandra's father had not known she was there, but she had been a silent witness to it all. At the time, Cassandra believed her father had loved the girl. Why else would he have said such things to her? But as she grew older, she learned why she had never seen the nobleman's daughter after that night. Now the words came to the forefront of her mind once more. Cassandra giggled, and she took a step backward and looked at her toes. "I know it's silly, but would you dance with me?" she asked. Silence. "Okay," she whispered and held up her hand to meet her partner's, as was customary in the Omanese tradition. She had always been a marvelous dancer, even as a child. As their dance came to a close, she could sense she was going to be kissed. She closed her eyes and waited, imagining what it would be like. Lost in the moment, she opened her eyes and saw only herself in the mirrors. Her imaginary friend was gone. She lay down on the floor and stared up at the ceiling. Its bare surface was the only place she did not have to face her horrid reflection. She thought about her imaginary friend and began to ponder. Who had the worst fate, living in eternal torment or fading into oblivion? Alexander followed the guards to the prince's chambers. He had put up a good fight in the ring so as to keep the men's respect. He had lost the fight to protect Silas's reputation. Silas was a practiced fighter, but Alexander was a seasoned warrior. After their match, he had dismissed the men, cleaned himself up, and joined them for dinner. As the guards announced him and he entered the prince's chambers, he was surprised to find the room filled with art. He had seen rooms decorated with tributes to the greatness of their creator, but this was different. Alexander gazed at each piece, allowing himself to become immersed within the images. He let his eyes pass over them, unveiling the stories being portrayed and letting them come to life, almost feeling as if they were reliving someone else's memory. Pigments and paints, small lumps of charcoals, and chunks of mosaic tiles lay strewn about. Hundreds of portraits had been arranged, all different sizes, shapes, and mediums. Many of them were completed, while others were designed only to accentuate or practice certain features. Though they were all beautiful, every piece was of the same woman, which disturbed Alexander. As he approached the prince, who continued to work on his present painting, Alexander recollected the story of a painter who had been heard many years before. There had been a painter who had painted the portrait of a beautiful woman, a stranger who had visited his shop. Days passed, and she did not return. The painter began to stare at the portrait, imagining what she was like. Kind, beautiful, yet mysterious. He dreamed of her, longing for her. He fixated on all the flaws in his portrait, furious he had not mimicked God's creation better. He painted her portrait again and again, and she became an unachievable torment to him. The painter grew to be a bitter, old, unhappy man. Years later, a woman came to his shop and purchased the portrait. The painter told her he would have given anything to have known her name. The woman, turning to leave, told him her name. She had been right in front of him, but he had been so lost in his fantasy he had not recognized her. Alexander watched and admired the prince's skill as he finished the lady's golden hair, which fell in loose waves down the edges of a perfectly crafted jawline. Her crimson lips opened ever so slightly, betraying the illusion she was about to whisper a secret. Alexander found none of her features to be as distracting as her emerald green eyes. "She's beautiful," Alexander commented as he joined the prince near his work. "The likes of whom no man has seen in centuries," the prince answered, setting down his brush. "Who is she?" Alexander asked with a gesture towards the painting. "Have you not heard the legend?" Silas asked in surprise. "Centuries ago, the king of Omenes had a daughter. As a child, she begged an enchantress to make her beautiful. The enchantress gifted her with eternal life, eternal youth, and an unnatural beauty. This pleased the king. He took pride in his daughter, throwing many parties and bragging about her gifts. It was not long before the whole world had heard of this girl." Silas stepped away from the painting, motioning for Alexander to join him at the window. As she matured, so did her beauty. Every man and every king became enamored with the thought of her, and the threat of a world war surfaced. Upon realizing this, her father confined her to the castle, but it did not end there. He knew he had to dispose of her. He ordered a tower erected and locked his daughter away. Silas said, pointing to the tower which rose up from the center of the city. He swore if any man could ascend the tower from the outside, he could have the princesses in marriage. Many men tried to climb, but none prevailed. After several years and hundreds of deaths, people began to forget about the princess and her beauty. Silas ended his story. Many don't understand the price of beauty. Those who have it often believe it defines their worth, and those who desire it can be led to something truly hideous. Alexander said after brief reflection. So which are you, Silas teased, the beautiful or the seeker of beauty? Neither anymore, Alexander answered. What about you? Why your fascination with her? He tried to be generous by not calling it an obsession. A smile broke across the prince's face as he asked, Alexander, do you believe in destiny? And Alexander nodded. They say I am destined for greatness, and when fate puts something right in front of you, isn't it obvious? Silas nodded towards the window in the tower beyond. I saw a door at the base of the tower, Alexander stated. It locks from the inside, Silas answered. We presume it is for whoever makes it to the top, so they will not have to climb down. Have you ever attempted to climb? Alexander asked. No, the prince answered, a troubled look coming over him. My father would not permit it. He believes the legend is silly and dangerous. I am my father's only heir, much too valuable to be lost to the tower. There is wisdom in your father's words, Alexander replied. Unfortunately, Silas muttered, accustomed to his response. Forgive me for earlier, he said, changing topics and moving away from the window. I had to know you were committed to the cause. The city depends on it. I saw the mark on your right shoulder when you were training the men. You were a legionary. A fog fell over Alexander's eyes. Silas poured 2 glasses of wine, handing one to Alexander. He swirled the dark liquid in his glass as he continued. Last I knew, the warriors of Legion trained were impossible to stop. So I am to believe you are out of practice, or that you let me win? Alexander said nothing. I thought so, Silas said, sipping his wine. I have heard rumors of the enemy who approaches. They say he is an unstoppable savage who cannot be reasoned with. He brings nations to their knees. Tell me, Alexander, you are a warrior. But do you believe we can train the army to withstand a warlord? I know without me you won't. Silas finished his wine, remaining neutral to Alexander's response. He dismissed Alexander and returned to his moral and most recent portrait. As Alexander approached the door, he looked back for a moment with one last question. The girl in the tower. What's her name? I wish I knew, Silas answered. Within the month, Alexander created an army. He kept the men on a rigorous training schedule. He knew there would never be legionnaires, but he would settle for soldiers. He didn't want them broken. He wanted them ready. He did everything alongside them, eating, sleeping, and the constant running. When Alexander had first joined the Legion, he had hated running. It had been difficult and painful. Most nights he had gone to bed wondering if it would be better to cut off his legs than to endure another day of the torture. In the end, running had saved him. He spent time with each of the men, one by one, in the pit, making sure they were ready for single combat. Most were not, but after several rounds in the pit, each learned to hold his own. He ran them back through mock sieges, training them in strategies of defending the castle walls. He put them under intense pressure, but it is in pressure that diamonds are made. And he started with coal, and now he had diamonds, sharp diamonds. Training ceased for 3 days as the announcement of the king's passing. Shops closed, the soldiers were dismissed, and the city sank into mourning. The king's body was placed on a pyre, and after respects were paid, he was purified by fire for the afterlife. Alexander continued running the men until the day the lookout came for him. The enemy will be here tomorrow, said the soldier. Time seemed to stop, and we will be ready. Silas stood at the edge of the top of the legendary tower, looking down on the city below. His father had loved Armenes, and now his father was gone. His beloved city was as he was now, fatherless. Why? He heard her ask from behind him. He didn't want to turn to face her, but he was powerless. There she stood before him, the angel who haunted him like a ghost, her ocean eyes releasing rivers of tears. Silas had never decided what was worse, the knowledge of what would come, or the knowledge that he could not stop it. "Why?" she begged. "Why did you leave me here?" They stood, silent, motionless. Silas could feel his heart pounding. The question seemed to echo in his ears. He had walked away from the tower so many times, and every time he had been walking away from her. The truth had become unbearable, and it crushed him like a weight. He could not have climbed the tower years ago, and years ago he had desired to. Perhaps it had been his father's words of caution, or maybe he had just grown to be a coward. Either way, a small sliver of despair had sunk into the prince's heart like a fishhook, but instead of pulling him up, it dragged him down into the depths of the darkness. "Because," he began, the air seemed to leave his lungs as he felt as though his very soul was leaving with it. "Because I was afraid." She turned away, and he reached for her, but it was too late. He was falling. Faster and faster he fell. Silas's eyes flashed open, a cold sweat soaking his body. He had fallen asleep on his father's throne. He rose, disturbed, and began to pace the long rectangular throne room. 3 pillars stood on either side of him, 6 in total, behind which were the mosaic-covered walls. A fire pit in the center provided the room with heat, and though the fire burned low, lost in his thoughts, he wandered through the space. Confident he was alone, Silas turned back to his father's former seat. He knelt down, feeling it would respect his father's memory, the only thing the chair now possessed. "Father, forgive me," he began, approaching, as if his father was still there or could somehow still hear him. "I am afraid." Silence answered his words, and although he had grown accustomed to the same response from his father, this silence felt much deeper and resonated within him. Their relationship had been strained, but in his father's final moments, Silas had stood by his side. It had been too late to rehash the old arguments and emotions, as his father had lost the ability to speak and most of his consciousness. Silas tried to remember their last conversation, but he could not. The king was dead, and a warlord approached the city even as Silas mourned. The city seemed to be an infant left on a mountaintop to brave the elements. The responsibility of the throne towered over him, and Silas closed his eyes as he heard his small tears kiss the stone floor. He no longer knelt. He crumbled. Had his father ever had any faith in him? This was not the first tower Silas had faced. He had been 14 the first time he told his father of his desire to make the climb. Not only had the king refused to let him, but he added doubt to his son's dream, asking the boy, "Even supposing you did make it, what if she's a witch, not a princess? What if she's actually trapped, and you ended up releasing her?" Silas's dreams had been like beautiful tapestry, and his father unraveled every strand to try and make something of his own. His father had undercut his desire to be a warrior as well, saying, "To prepare for war is to invite it. Politics and negotiations, that is what I shall teach you." Silas had ignored his words and trained with the palace guard. But as soon as the threat of Cain arose, his father had called Alexander. Silas rose. He passed by the throne and pushed through 2 giant doors which led to a terrace. The cool twilight rushed to greet him. He walked to the rail and looked out over the ocean, breathing the salt air and listening to the waves lapping far below. It was almost peaceful. His father had been the king of peace, and now Silas found himself faced with a time of war. He felt empty and unprepared, as if he had dreamt of everything and accomplished nothing. He wondered if his father had had dreams. If he had, he must have given up on them long before Silas was born. Cain's army approaches. How am I to defend a city? He asked, looking out to the night sky. If Cain conquers us, he will burn the place to the ground and leave my people to the dogs. I'm sorry, Father. I want my legacy to be more than ash and bones. Alexander sat perched on the wall of the city, waiting with patience for what the following morning would bring. Silas, who he had not seen since the king's funeral, joined him on the wall. With the death of the king and the impending siege, Alexander didn't have to guess whether Silas had a lot on his mind. They sat in silence until Silas broke the peace. I heard they have arrived. Just beyond the ridge, Alexander answered, motioning to the distance. Alexander, where were you when my father's men came for you? In a tavern. That's not what I meant. You meant what happened to me after the Legion? Alexander continued to stare out into the darkness. He was a simple man who did not enjoy reflecting on the past. He had done that for too long. He had come to believe the past should not be forgotten, but it should not rule one's future. He did not enjoy telling his own story, but Silas had a right to know. My father lived the life of a soldier. When I was a boy, I did not see him often, but I loved my father. I wanted to be just like him, a man of glory, honor, and danger. When I was old enough, I joined the 7th Legion. I wanted to make him proud. I learned war was nothing like he or his friends had discussed. I saw and did many gruesome and cruel things. I found very little glory and even less honor. Eventually, the Legion took on a force too strong, and we were defeated. I ran like a coward, and they hunted me, until a woman named Sayorsi, who lived in the woods, hid me from them. I stayed with her for years, and she was quite beautiful. One day, a prince sent for her. I sat alone in her absence, and in the silence I heard faint voices. I thought I was hearing things and ignored it, but in time I realized it was coming from a hole behind the house. The hole led to a cave, and the cave was a tiny metal box. Where are you? I called. I'm here, they replied. We are fairies, and the witch trapped us in here. Please, sir, help free us, and we, in turn, shall help free you. At this point, Sayorsi returned, and she asked what I was doing, and I told her I had heard voices. She kissed me, and assured me no one was there. Months went by, and I cannot help but wonder. So one night, I returned to the box in the cave, sitting with it, listening. I could bear it no longer. I threw open the lid, expecting nothing would happen. The room was illuminated by a light of 1,000 fairies. They swarmed and they sang all through the room. As they moved, I noticed whatever they touched changed. I saw the cave was filled with books, tools, and substances for practicing the dark arts. Sayorsi found me and screamed, transforming into a hideous old witch. She attacked, but the fairies brought me my sword, and with their help I defeated her. I ran again, ashamed and disgusted, and I continued to run for years, until I stumbled upon a tavern where I was given an offer to face my past. I decided it was time to face my demons, not run from them. Alexander stood in silence. The night seemed to have gotten colder. Silas reviewed the story in his mind. Do you think we stand a chance against Cain? He asked, as though they were partners in a game of dice. Go rest, Silas. You're going to need it. Silas waited as Alexander continued to walk off into the night. Wait! Who conquered the Legion? Silas called, but Alexander was gone. The night dragged on, but Alexander could not sleep. He remembered how excitement had kept him up before his first battle, and how, after he had never truly slept again, he had inspected the castle walls and talked with sentries. He now walked through the streets until he found himself at the base of the legendary tower. He could not explain what drew him to the tower, but he had gone. It looked as though it touched the sky. He reached for it, but hesitated before touching it, as if it were a sacred vessel of some sort, or as if by touching it he would somehow contact the woman trapped inside it. He scoffed at his own ridiculousness. He grabbed a smooth, cool stone, found a handhold, and began to climb. Arm over arm, he pulled himself higher. He made good progress until a small piece of rock broke under his foot. Alexander slipped and braced himself as his body smashed up against the rock wall. He looked down as he tried to adjust his footing. He had risen much higher than he had thought. He continued to climb, resolving not to look down again. As he neared the top, the climb began taking its toll. His arms were sore, but he knew there was no turning back. He could see the ledge. At the top of the tower there was an octagonal structure made of glass. There was just enough of a rim for a man to stand on and carefully walk around. Alexander took a deep breath and looked for the next handhold, but the rock went smooth. His muscles strained to keep him against the wall. He reached up, but it was useless. He shifted his weight, trying to let his muscles relax. He looked over his shoulder at the first rays of the sun peeked over the horizon. "This is it," he whispered to himself as he let go of the wall and lunged up towards the ledge. She had been poisoned by her own request. The poison had spread through her, but instead of condemning her to death, it cursed her to immortal life. It had contaminated her with the features of a goddess, forever ostracizing her from humanity. Cassandra often dreamt of what could have happened if her father had not built the tower. She would have left, ran away from the far edge of the earth. She could have married, not a king, but a poor farmer. They would not live in a castle, but in the most remote area of the world. She would captivate him, and he would love her. But how could a man love a goddess? No, he would use her. She would not be his goddess, but his charm, his talisman. Then they would come for her, and there would be war, death, and destruction. Cassandra awoke from her nightmare, upset as always. Her body felt numb and cold. It was as if another lifetime had been ripped from her and cast into the fires of hell. She was wrong to dream. The tower was safer. It was the only way she could protect humanity, the only way she could protect herself. Picking herself up from the floor, she watched her reflection in the mirror. With brisk steps, she approached as she thought it were an enemy. "I hate you," she screamed, driving her fist into the image. She almost laughed as she felt the skin of her hand split. The mirror cracked like a spider's web and fell into 1,000 pieces. She looked down at the fractured reflection of her face. Her long dark hair, her skin, and those sad eyes which had once held so much life. "There I am," she thought. A drop of dark red blood distracted her as it fell from her hand. There would be no scars. Before the beauty she had tried so many times to taint or mar her beauty, but it was all in vain. She had thrown away her purity, but her father had been quick to put a stop to that. So much for her, but for the family name. Confined to her room, her first prison, she had cut herself only to watch her skin heal before the bleeding had stopped. No one who saw her would ever know the hundreds of scars she bore beneath her skin. She picked up a shot of the mirror, embracing the temptation once more. That is when she saw him. In front of her, in the space where the mirror had been, stood a man. At first she was afraid, until she realized between them stood a transparent wall of glass. How long has he been there? She wondered, approaching with caution. Who are you? She whispered. The man continued to stare. Who are you? She shouted at him, once again angry and afraid. The man didn't flinch. He placed his hand on the glass wall and tapped it with his fingers. Cassandra reached up and put her hand against his. A solid inch divided them. She looked at his eyes, and they were fixated on her. He lowered his eyes to the shard of mirror in her hand. She dropped it, embarrassed. She looked back at her. What is it? She thought. What? She whispered to the glass. He produced a dagger. Cassandra took a step back before remembering the barrier between them. She stared in disbelief as the man took the blade and slowly slid it across his shoulder. She wanted to stop him. She dipped his finger into the blood and wrote on the glass. She shook her head, unable to understand. The fool! He doesn't realize it is backward on my side. When he finished, he pointed to the mirror behind her. She turned and saw what he had written. You are lovable and worthy of being loved. She turned back to him, but he was gone. The morning light ran across the ice-crusted snow, reflecting in the eyes of the watchman. He stared out into the distance, squinting, searching for anything that might betray the enemy position. Then he heard horns, and the enemy poured over the hill. The watchman raised the alarm. Alexander thought about what had just transpired as he walked through the streets back towards his post. He had made it to the top of the tower and found himself face to face with the most beautiful young woman he had ever seen. She sat imprisoned in a room where the walls were made of mirrors. Behind each mirror was an inch of glass for support. He had seen her through the brokenness, and she had seen him. Her eyes had spoken all of her secrets. He had told her what he had wished someone had told him so many years ago. Then he had left through a spiral staircase that descended on the inside wall of the tower. His thoughts were interrupted by a messenger who ran up shouting, Sir, sir, come quickly. Are they approaching? Alexander asked. Are they at the walls? No, sir. They've breached the main gate. Alexander threw his sword, and he was already running before the messenger had finished. As Alexander rounded a corner, he saw the enemy had broken their defenses. A handful of Cain's men had taken the ramparts and the gate room, raising the gate for their companions. Alexander's disordered men froze in shock as they watched the enemy begin to pour in like water, rushing through a severed dam. Alexander charged up the steps into the wall, dispatching enemies as he went. Soon the city would be overrun. He ducked under an enemy sword and retaliated by slicing the man's throat. He charged for the gate room. The only thing between him and the destination appeared to be the giant with an axe. The man towered over him. Alexander jumped up onto the edge of the wall, launching himself towards his opponent. The man grabbed Alexander before he could strike. He felt the man's fingers lock around his throat. Like lightning, Alexander drew his dagger and sliced it through the man's inner arm. The giant-like man yelped in pain, and Alexander drove the dagger into the side of the man's neck. The huge man grabbed at his wound before toppling over the snow-covered ledge. Wasting no time, Alexander charged into the gate room, dashing to the release lever for the gate. He pulled it down hard and heard a rumbling followed by a great crash below him. He breathed a sigh of relief. The city would not fall today. Rage rose from deep within Silas's heart. He had been a fool. Worse, he had been betrayed. Silas had watched the enemy charge the city. He had fought them on the ramparts of the wall. Alexander had not come. The enemy had launched its attack, and in fear, Silas had sought out Alexander, who was nowhere to be found. The man who his father had claimed would save the city
He should have stayed on the walls. He should have saved the city himself. When Silas had finally found him, Alexander had been slipping out of the door, the ancient door which had never been opened, the door to the tower. He had been inside and had seen her. The enemy battered the gates, and where was the city's hero? Here, stealing the only thing the king had not been able to take from him. Reality set in. His father was dead, and he was alone. Before Silas could do anything, Alexander had disappeared. Silas sat at his father's throne brooding. There had to be a way to prove himself. If he could not outfight Alexander, he would outthink him. His mind fell to the ancient stories his father had made him study, when Silas should have been training to fight. A lot of good they will do me now, he thought. They had been stories of warriors, kings, and poets. He sat, his face like stone, until one story surfaced in Silas's mind. A wry smile crept across his face as the gears of his mind began to turn. The story, commonly known as the Wordsmith, was one of the darker tales he had ever been taught. The Wordsmith was an evil poet who tricked a great hero into giving up his true love. The poet's words were so sweet and so deceptive. For the hero to get his love back, the wordsmith convinced the hero to give up their firstborn son. Many years later, the poet tricks the son, who returns only to kill his own father. The lesson being, men of sweet words must be dealt with cautiously. Everybody wants something, was the famous line of the wordsmith. Silas now mulled it over again and again. He wanted the girl in the tower, and he wanted to save his legacy. Cain wanted the city, the prestige. But what if there was something else? What else could Cain, the conqueror, possibly want? Silas rose and called for the captain of the guard. The captain arrived, and Silas told him, "Relieve Alexander of his post and his armor. Escort him to the prison and await further instruction." The captain stood hesitant. "Go, or you will join him," Silas shouted, and then he summoned a messenger. Silas, the wordsmith, he thought. "You called, sir?" the messenger asked. "I want you to deliver a message to Cain," Silas said, looking up. "Tell him I have something he wants." Cursed for eternity. This is how Cassandra had envisioned herself, condemned by her own words to be forever alone. Now she found herself plagued by new words, words written in blood. She stood inches away from the glass, no longer fascinated with her own reflection so much as she was with the words of a stranger. "You are lovable and worthy of being loved." How he could possibly believe that? Or was this merely a lie to win her over? But it was written in blood, his blood. Cassandra looked down from her tower, watching the fire consume the city. It was a plague, spreading with a swiftness and fierceness she had not witnessed for hundreds of years. The glass prevented the sounds of anguished cries from reaching her ears, but it did not cease the horror of the spectacle. Cain's men raced through the gates like hundreds of people fled, their instinct to survive overtaking them. Like ocean waves ramming a ship against the rocks, the enemy destroyed everything in their path, leaving bodies and debris in their wake. The day Cassandra had been placed in the tower, there had been riots. Chaos outside the palace and armies perched outside the city gates. Her people had hated her, cursed her name for bringing trouble to their city. They did not know how or why she had become so beautiful. All they knew was that they could not bear it. It had to be tainted or eradicated, but it could not stay. She had not intended any of it. How could she have known the gravity of her request? Now she watched the fate which had befallen her city, a fate she was in part responsible for. She traced the letters of his words with her fingers as she began to question which was truth and which was the lie. A bare skin of Alexander's feet rested on the cold stone floor. He had been about to summon the prince for a council of war when the captain of the guard came for him with 4 additional men. They had been torn by their duty. He had not resisted them. He had been stripped of his weapons and armor. His hands were securely tied behind his back with a thick shackle that chafed his skin the more he struggled. He sat waiting in the darkness until what he guessed were the late hours of the day, before a sliver of light pierced the artificial night, growing larger, like a small blade severing a rich fabric. The door opened, and 8 men entered the room bearing torches. 4 of the palace guard, 2 of Cain's soldiers, Silas and Cain. So he tried to make a deal. Alexander glared at Silas, who skulked back into the shadows. A large figure stepped forward. Even in the dim lighting of the torches, there was no mistaking him. His hair flowed long and unkempt, like a lion's mane. A necklace of teeth from the beasts he had killed decorated his chest. His clothes had been made of animal hides, and he moved as though he were more animal than man. Cain, Alexander whispered. He bears the mark of the Legion on his arm, Silas offered. Cain crouched like a cat to Alexander's level. His breath bathed Alexander's face in the stench of rotting animals. Cain's empty eyes seemed to soak up the defiance in Alexander's as they stared at each other. No words were spoken, and none were necessary. After several moments, Cain rose. Kill, he uttered, just above a whisper, and Cain's 2 soldiers struck down the palace guards like bolts of lightning. Silas watched, stunned. The 2 men turned on him. He struggled and protested, but he was at their mercy. They beat him and dragged him into the cell, chaining him to the wall next to Alexander. Without another word, Cain left. His 2 soldiers followed, Silas calling after them. Where are they going? Silas asked, still trying to wrap his mind around the situation. He turned to Alexander, who had his eyes closed as if meditating. Alexander, Silas snapped, fear and anger in his voice. Without opening his eyes, Alexander said, They are taking your city. That's impossible, Silas responded. 3 men cannot take a city. But even as he spoke the words, he knew the truth. Cain and his men were heading straight for the gatehouse, and once they had opened the doors, there would be no stopping them. Alexander did not respond, returning to wherever he had been before Silas interrupted. Alexander could not tell if the muffled screaming in the distance was real or in his mind. The 7th Legion had fallen, and the survivors were being slaughtered by their captors. Under the bodies of his friends and the fallen, he crawled away, choking on the pools of blood which the saturated land had rejected. Slowly, move slowly, only one chance. He dragged himself, digging his elbows in and not moving his legs at all. He didn't want to attract attention. He lay still as enemy troops passed him by. They laughed and bantered like a bunch of drunken animals. One stopped, and Alexander wondered for a moment if he had been discovered. He heard the sound of a man relieving himself. Once he had finished, they continued on. Alexander looked up to see Silas among the bodies next to him. He looked tired, cold, and depressed, but not dead. Confused, Alexander stared at him. Silas had not been at the fall of the Legion. Then Silas spoke. From where do you draw your strength? Alexander looked up to see Silas among the bodies next to him. He looked tired, cold, and depressed, but not dead. Confused, Alexander stared at him. Silas had not been at the fall of the Legion. Then Silas spoke. From where do you draw your strength? The sound of a latch brought Silas back to himself. He sat with Silas in the dark of the prison. The temperature had dropped, and his body had begun to shiver. The door opened, and Cain returned with his men. Silas began shouting, demanding answers. "What have you done, Cain? You have no right. We made a deal. You can't just come into the city and do as you please." Cain turned to leave. Silas went silent. "Kill them both. Outside. Let the animals feast on the dead," Cain said to his men. "Why?" Silas demanded, groveling. "We made a deal. Besides, I am of no use to you dead. I am Cain. You are a child in the den of wolves. You have no use." He left. His men wasted no time. They unshackled the prisoners and bound their wrists with the thin twine, which sliced up into the skin if tampered with. They pushed the two prisoners up the stairs and out the door into the frigid morning air. Disoriented by the blinding light of the day and assaulted by the turmoil and chaos which had befallen the city, Alexander stumbled and fell. People were crying and screaming, many for the last time. Somewhere, between the heat of the burning houses and the icy breath of the wind, Alexander felt death kiss him as it passed by, as if to say to him, "We will meet again soon." The winter snow was no longer pure, but muddied and stained with shades of red. Whose blood it was, Alexander did not know. People screamed, and Alexander passed by bodies piled in the street. He shed a single tear. Now was not the time to weep. They left the city by the main gate and turned north to follow along the coastal cliffs. There was a forest to the north, and it was just after they crossed into it, and omnis that could no longer be seen, Cain's men ordered them to stop. "Kneel," barked the smaller of the two men, shoving them both forward. Alexander dropped to his knees with a look of resignation. Silas fell to the ground, still trying to reason his way out of his mistake. "At least I have the decency to face death like a man," Alexander growled to him. The smaller soldier took out his dagger and approached Alexander. Cain's men had made only one mistake, but it was enough. They had bound Alexander's hands in the front. The man with the dagger never would have guessed the bruised and bloodied prisoner would be so fast. Alexander lunged forward, catching the dagger hand and forcing it back into the chest of his would-be executioner. He spun around his enemy, snatching his sword from the man's belt. The other soldier, realizing what had happened, managed to draw his sword halfway from its scabbard before Alexander finished him. Alexander wasted no time. He began to strip the bodies of any essential tools. He took the taller man's oversized shirt to protect himself from the cold and the wind. He quickly took off the man's boots and slid his own frozen feet into them. He grabbed two swords. "We should move," he said, cutting Silas's bonds and handing him a sword. "You're not going to kill me?" Silas asked, confused. "I made a promise to your father," Alexander replied. They pressed deeper into the snow-covered forest, neither speaking for some time. Thick pines surrounded them on all sides, shielding them from the ocean wind. Silas watched the dead, ice-covered brush, which seemed to be reaching up from the snow as if trying to escape the death winter had brought. Only the poison berry bushes had survived the cold, and Silas could not help but feel like he was one of them. Poison. "I'm sorry," Silas began. "I betrayed you. I betrayed my kingdom. I was afraid to be a king, and after I saw you had climbed the tower, I was angry. My father wanted many things from me. I had only ever wanted her." Alexander paused for a moment. "Your father loved you," he said. "And I him," Silas responded. Silence returned, and they continued their aimless journey. Silas retreated back to his guilt. "Where are we going?" Silas asked, as the woods ended just before the drop into the ocean. "Back," answered Alexander. Silas stilled, as if winter's wind had frozen him straight through. "I cannot go back," Silas stated. "Why not?" "You are their king." "I am no king. I am a coward. Your people need you." "No, my people need you," he shouted. The ferocity of the ocean seemed to match their tones, rising and falling in a great crescendo. "What are you so afraid of?" Alexander prodded. "I'm afraid to die." "You asked me where I draw my strength from." Silas looked puzzled. "I thought you were asleep." "Never mind that. Did you ask?" "Yes." "You are not as brave if you have no fear. You are a fool." True bravery is looking your fear in the face and saying, "I will never surrender." True strength is not when you overcome, but when you struggle and you grit your teeth. You decide to give something more than you thought you were capable of. You are not so much afraid to die as you are to live, Silas. The wind caught bits of snow and sea spray, taunting Silas as it whipped by. "I will go, but I cannot lead them," he said. "You must." The sea began to pick up again. "Do not be afraid to be their king," Alexander said, putting a hand on Silas's shoulder. Silas gazed once more at the fallen city, his city. "Do you have a plan?" Silas asked. Alexander smiled and tossed Silas a berry he had picked. "These are poisonous," Silas said. "Exactly," Alexander answered. In the distance, the sun set on the horizon. It melted into a potent red that seemed to permeate the land, red like the blood now covering the streets of the once glorious city. The princess had broken the rest of the mirrors and now watched through a glass prison, a canary in a cage. Click. There it was, the sound of the trap-door latch. Cassandra turned to see the man who had ascended the tower and left her with such a wonderful yet troubling message. The man who had made the climb. Truly, he was a man. As Cassandra looked towards the threshold of her future, she stepped away in fear. Her man had not come. Instead stood a dark creature. Click. There it was, the sound of the trap-door latch. Cassandra turned to see the man who had ascended the tower and left her with such a wonderful yet troubling message. The man who had made the climb. Truly, he was a man. As Cassandra looked towards the threshold of her future, she stepped away in fear. Her man had not come. Instead stood a dark figure, and he had the eyes of an animal. Silas never thought of getting back into the city would be as easy as walking in the front gate. It had been left wide open, as a mouth crying out in the pain, or perhaps trying to spew forth the disease which had taken it. Cain did not command kingdoms. He and his men were marauders. They came and they went like the winter's wind. After seizing the castle, Cain's men tore through the city like banshees, leaving nothing untouched. The glassy eyes of the dead reflected the firelight which consumed their beloved homes. The scent of blood and smoke hung thick in the air like black debris, fell gently like snow, covering the possessions of the dead which littered the boulevards. The path of the destruction had snaked its way through the city, all the way to the palace itself. Once the massacre had ended, the celebration had begun. The men ate, drank, and divided the spoils of war. The human remains would lie rotting until the birds picked their bones dry, a testament to the lion who had chosen his new den. As night swept across the land, those who slept now would likely sleep forever. Silas and Alexander had scavenged enough equipment to pass as some of Cain's men. A deep cold washed down Silas's spine as they approached the gate. His face began to feel the warmth of the fiery remains of his beloved city. The city burned as if it had been cast into hell, and the bodies of his father's people his people, lay dead in the streets. It felt as if their ghosts had all gathered behind him and now pushed him towards the fire with their cold hands. He should burn for what he had done, he thought to himself. I should burn forever. Are you ready? Alexander asked, looking back to him. Yes, Silas answered, and he stepped through the gate. Darkness had fallen across the city. Silas and Alexander had used the firelight to see, sticking to the shadows. The cobblestone streets were now broken and scarred. The winter snow had melted, and blood stained each stone. Statues, monuments, and other artwork the city had treasured had been broken and tossed to the streets. Silas remained silent as they slipped through the city to the wine cellars. He would let them eat, let them drink, and let them celebrate their devastating victory. Then he would strike, like a dagger, small, quick, and precise. When they arrived at the wine cellar, they found it had been picked almost clean. Only a handful of bottles remained untouched. This won't be enough, Alexander stated. Silas wanted to scream. This was the only plan. It had to work. They had to make it work. We can water it down, Silas said, picking up 2 jugs. There is a well not far from here. I will get the water. There is a cart in the back we used for selling the wine. Strip it and put those barrels on it. Not the big ones, the small ones. Fill them evenly with whatever wine we have left. Then we will mix the water. Alexander smiled, but Silas didn't see it. He had left. After several trips to the well, the barrels were almost ready. Alexander and Silas began to squeeze the poison berries, which they had brought from the wood, into each. Only a little in each, said Alexander. Even if it doesn't kill them, they can't fight if they are sick as dogs. When it was done, they put a ladle in each bucket and rolled the cart out onto the street. Alexander couldn't help but smile as Silas called out to enemy soldiers to get their wine. Out of all this time in the Legion, after all his journeys and travels, this had to be one of the craziest things he had ever done. However, he had faith it would work. One by one, he watched as Cain's men came over and had a few sips, then cursed them for giving out such terrible drink. It had been brilliant to water down the wine. It had ensured nobody would take more than a few sips, or try to take the cart from them. They moved on, street after street, making their stops as brief as possible. The plan was not finished. They had to find the survivors and rescue them. There was no victory in saving the city if all of her people were dead. They wandered until the barrels were down to the dregs. Silas looked to Alexander, anxiety filling him. We will find them, Alexander said. I know, Silas answered. They continued on, as the city grew quieter as their work took effect. Then it grew quite loud again, as Silas and Alexander came upon one of the smaller city squares. Silas remembered the local farmers had often set up their market there. People had stood in long lines waiting to get vegetables, bread, and other sorts of food. Now there were lines of people waiting to be executed. Their tear-stained faces were downcast with the knowledge of their fate. Some tried to comfort, others stood in shock. Their spirits had been broken. 3 men sat in the far corner of a table playing some sort of gambling game. Silas guessed they were higher in the ranks. Several guards walked up and down the lines, weapons drawn, keeping everyone in order as they awaited death. The executioner stood in the center with a chopping block, sharpening an incredible axe. 3 more men filled a cart with the bodies of the decapitated. Silas's mouth gaped at the sight. What do you want? Grumbled an archer as he approached them. He was older and looked as though he had seen many battles. A black patch covered his left eye, and he walked with a faint limp. Everyone turned to the newcomers. We have more wine, Silas explained, trying to sound excited and perhaps a bit tipsy. The archer looked into the bucket and cocked his head a bit. Seems like you got not much left," he stated. Silas wanted to kick him for not dumping the remnants, and with just 1 or 2 buckets to make it seem as though there had been more. "Bring it here anyway," shouted one of the men at the gaming table, who stood and waved. Silas smiled and nodded at the archer as he and Alexander pushed the cart towards the table. "Wait!" came a cry, distant at first, but it grew louder. Silas turned to see a man running up to the archer. He recognized him. Alexander had served some of his friend's wine, but this man hadn't drunk any. Silas glanced at Alexander, who remembered as well. Their hoax was done. Silas exploded towards the 2 men, drawing his sword and slashing off the messenger's head. Spinning with a practiced grace, he drove the blade through the archer before anyone knew what was happening. Silas let the blade fall with the old man, grabbing his bow as he went. The first arrow was knocked and ready as the first of his opponents charged him. He released the arrow, and it struck true. Alexander charged the 3 men at the table and made quick work of them. He turned with just enough time to dodge the axe blade of the executioner. A small battle ensued, ending with people of Omenes looking to their saviors. Silas stood before them, Alexander at his side. "Let's take back our home," the prince shouted. Using whatever they could find as weapons, the last men of Omenes went to work reclaiming their city. The streets, once a testament to the glory of man, now black and charred, seemed to be a tribute to death. As the survivors passed through the streets, many could not help but feel that they were in some foreign place. Had they not known what had wrought such destruction, they might have guessed a dragon had attacked. They kept to the shadows, following the sounds of laughter, cutting the throats of the drunk and unsuspecting invaders as they went. As they reached the center of the city, they came upon a mob of men feasting outside the palace. The moment had come. This would decide the fate of their city. Together, the men of Omenes stepped into the light and descended upon the enemy, tearing them to pieces. "Silas," Alexander called, "it's time." And Silas knew what he meant, and together they left the fray to find Cain. The enemy had soiled their beloved city, and the throne room was no exception. The 6 pillars which led to the throne were the only things still intact. The walls, once beautiful with mosaics, were now broken, shards of stone littering the floor. A fire burned bright in the city pit. The 6 pillars which led to the throne were the only things still intact. The walls, once beautiful with mosaics, were now broken, shards of stone littering the floor. A fire burned bright in the center pit. Cain sat upon the throne. Scars covered his defined body, and he looked like a sculpture of a war god. Everything about him seemed to worship death, except for the spark of life that passed through his eyes. By his side, Alexander saw the girl from the tower. She stood next to the throne, bound by a slave's chains, one on each wrist and the other at her throat. Even in captivity, her beauty shone through. Her eyes held an ocean of sorrow within them, and a desire to be free of it all. As she watched Alexander approach, her eyes seemed to change and hold a drop of hope. "Cain," Alexander called, "this is between us." Cain rose from the throne, pulling the girl closer with one arm, raising her to her tiptoes by her chains. She wiggled and writhed as her bonds began to choke her. A twisted smile passed across Cain's lips, as if he were a demented child who was enjoying torturing his new puppy. "Let her go," Alexander commanded. "Women," Cain said, lowering her just enough for her to gasp. "I will never understand the fascination." He licked the side of her face. Alexander bore down on Cain with a fury like never before. Cain shoved the girl to the floor, reaching for his weapon. Alexander's sword came crashing down as Cain's rose to meet it. Silas froze, watching the spectacle. two gods locked in combat, equal in skill and determination. He tried to rush to his friend's aid, but Cain saw him coming. Shifting his weight, Cain sent Alexander sprawling into Silas's path. The two collided and toppled to the floor. Cain didn't miss a beat. Everything happened so fast, Silas hardly noticed the burning sensation run through his arm as he scrambled to his feet. He watched as Cain's blade continued past him, a trail of blood reaching through the air after the cold steel. Silas toppled away as Alexander shoved him out of the path of the next blow. Catching Alexander off balance, Cain disarmed him in an instant, and then with his free hand he grabbed Alexander and heaved him across the throne room. Alexander sprang to his feet, but the shark had gotten his first scent of blood. Cain crossed the room to Silas, and after a brief skirmish, disarmed him as well. Alexander knew most of the atrocities which had gained Cain the name of savage, but he was still surprised when Cain tackled Silas, howling like an animal, and began to beat, bite, and claw him. Silas covered his head with his arms, protecting himself as much as he could as Cain tried to tear him apart. Alexander grabbed Cain from behind in a chokehold. Cain slipped free, and Alexander retrieved his sword. They stood face to face once more. Alexander began the dance again, and this time, death danced with them. "No," Cassandra cried, and the words seemed to freeze in answer. Silas watched the iron clasps bite into her outstretched arms as Cassandra reached for Alexander. It was too late. Cain's blade slipped into Alexander's midsection and out the other side. Then, with a quick jerking motion, Cain pulled his sword back out. Alexander dropped to a knee, a look of disbelief flashing across his face. Then Cain grabbed him by his armor and dragged the fallen soldier across the throne room. Alexander trailed behind him like a rag doll, choking on the blood dribbling out of his mouth. Silas sprang up, his destiny clear. He had tried to run from it, but now he would honor the memory of his father or join him in the afterlife. He ran towards the balcony after them, grabbing Alexander's fallen sword as he went. Cain turned to face him. Clang after clang sounded as the two swords met, and Silas matched Cain, and with each passing moment his fear faded. Snow had begun to fall from the cloud-covered night sky, and the waves of the ocean crashed below. With a final savage strike, Cain shattered Silas's sword and watched as a look of realization passed over the young prince's face. He would die tonight. He turned away, desperately looking for something with which to defend himself. His eyes caught on the girl sobbing in chains. Who is she? He wondered. Then realizing how absurd the thought was, he turned back to face his enemy. But Cain was gone. One moment Silas had stood face to face with death, and the next he stood alone. He looked over the balcony's edge and found Cain gripping the banister, muscles bulging as he tried to pull himself back up. Alexander had mustered his strength and, grabbing Cain from behind, had thrown himself backward over the terrace edge. Even now, face white as a ghost, Alexander still held on. He was a dead man haunting his killer. Silas met Alexander's eyes. No words were spoken and none were necessary. Alexander slipped one of the daggers out of Cain's belt and stabbed Cain through the back of the heart. Silas watched as death embraced them both and dragged them to the depths of the ocean. Amenes was reclaimed that night. Amenes was reclaimed that night, and Cain's army was defeated. The city mourned for weeks, but rebuilt itself. Silas was crowned king. A monument was built in honor of the great hero Alexander. It was not until later that Cassandra realized her hands were still scraped and her face was still bruised. The curse had been broken. She and Silas spent much time together, and never spoke of her origins. One night she found Silas burning his paintings. "Who is she?" Cassandra asked. "There is a legend here in Omenes of a princess locked in a tower," Silas began. "I know the legend," she interrupted. "These are her," he continued, "or at least my perception of her." Silas watched as the fire did its work. "Did you love her?" Cassandra asked. "I thought I did," Silas answered, "but the truth is I fell in love with an illusion. All of these paintings, all of my thoughts, they were beautiful, but not real." His thoughts fell to a story he had heard once, though he could not remember from where. It was the story of a painter. He shuddered at the thought. "Sometimes fate has something better for us than what we think we want," he concluded. He turned, leaving his art to burn, and walked to Cassandra. He smoothed back her hair from her face. Even with the scars Cain had left on her, she was beautiful. In his eyes, she always would be. "I love you, Cassandra." "I love you too." He kissed her gently on the lips. Then together they watched his art burn. "What do you think will happen to her?" he asked. "The girl in the tower?" "I think she will be fine."